Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're not just talking about ambition, we're diving deep into, well, the engineering of success.
Yeah, the nuts and bolts of it.
Exactly. Our mission here is to kind of synthesize core strategies from a bunch of areas: sales acceleration, organizational management, venture scaling, even behavioral psychology.
Right?
The goal is to give you, the listener, a clear, actionable roadmap. We want predictable business growth, sustained success. We're really looking for inevitability, not just, aspiration.
That really is the core idea. We've got a pretty substantial stack of sources here, and they all tend to treat business success less like some grand mystery.
Yeah, less like magic.
Right, and more like a set of interconnected, scalable systems. So for you, the curious learner, this deep dive is about understanding those specific leverage points, both the mechanical ones and the psychological ones.
Okay.
Points that, when you pull them correctly, they transform random results into predictable outcomes. We're going to try and show you where to invest your time for the absolute highest return.
Okay, fantastic. Let's unpack this right away then. Let's start with the absolute foundation of predictability, which the sources seem to agree on: sales systems and specialization. They start with a pretty dramatic but, I guess, necessary critique of where most companies seem to fail first. And it boils down to lead generation.
It really does. It sounds almost too simple, but it's often the most catastrophic failure point. When a business struggles to generate a sustainable, predictable flow of decent leads, well, everything else in the organization just becomes overwhelmingly difficult.
How so?
Think of it like a three-legged stool, right? You got your product, your people, and your process. When you don't have enough leads coming in, all three of those legs, they have to be absolutely perfect.
Okay.
You have zero buffer for error. Any little hiccup in training, any minor flaw in the product that hasn't been ironed out yet, or any slight deviation in how someone executes the process, it becomes a catastrophe.
That sounds like, frankly, a constant state of operational panic.
It often is.
So you're saying that if you can actually fix that lead problem, you sort of inadvertently fix a whole host of other internal issues, or at least give yourself room to fix them.
Precisely. The sources really emphasize this. Sustainable, predictable lead generation is like the ultimate systemic insurance policy. If you have that engine running reliably, the business can afford to do, and this is a quote, pretty much everything else wrong and still do really well.
Wow, okay. That's a bold statement.
It is, but that buffer it creates allows you to iterate on your product without fearing immediate collapse. It lets you train your people properly, refine your processes over time, all without that constant existential dread hanging over you.
What's fascinating to me looking through the research is the advice on actually getting started with this. I sort of assumed building a predictable engine meant, months of strategic planning meetings, thick content marketing strategy documents, massive preparation.
Yeah, the typical corporate approach.
Right, but the recommendation here is almost radical speed. Just go.
The bias toward action is just overwhelming in these sources. The advice is clear. Stop over-planning. Don't feel like you need to build hundreds of pieces of content up front or wait until you have the absolute perfect marketing tech stack.
Okay.
It's far more efficient, they argue, to just launch the first campaign immediately. Even if launching means just making a single targeted phone call, sending one carefully crafted email, or even one specific tweet.
Just one.
Just one to start, and then you learn as you go. Your lack of perfect resources, your lack of a giant budget, this shouldn't be the barrier that stops you from starting.
So what is the minimum viable preparation then? Do I need a full slide deck? A fancy website?
The bare minimum might be just one solid case study that shows results.
Yeah.
Or maybe a short introductory video that clearly explains your value proposition.
Okay, something tangible.
Yes. But critically, the research insists that even the lack of those materials shouldn't stop you from initiating that very first outreach campaign. You only figure out what resonates by actually making contact, not by endlessly polishing your internal documents in a vacuum.
Right, you learn from the market reaction. Okay, so once that initial activity, that first email or call, starts generating maybe a flicker of interest, a few leads, we quickly hit this mandate for specialization. You mentioned this is key for turning that initial spark into a scalable fire.
Absolutely key. The moment you want to move past, say, founder-led sales, where the founders are doing everything, and truly scale up the operation, you must specialize your people.
And the sources argue this needs to happen much sooner than most leadership teams think.
Much sooner. There's actually a great rule of thumb they suggest for timing this transition. It's sort of an 80-20 rule adaptation.
Okay.
When your sales representatives, looking at them as a group, are spending more than 20% of their collective time on a function that is secondary to their main goal, that's your trigger.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's say you have closers,
Yeah.
account executives, right? Their main job is closing deals. If you find that, on average, they're spending 25% of their day prospecting for new leads instead of working active deals, boom, it's time to specialize. It's time to break out the roles.
And the breakout needs to be specific. You mentioned 3 non-negotiable dedicated functions. This applies whether you have, what, 10 reps or 100?
Correct. It's about creating assembly lines, really, for consistency and scalability.
Okay, what are the 3?
First, you absolutely need an outbound prospecting function, often called sales development reps, or SDRs. Their sole job is generating qualified leads on demand, typically targeting companies who maybe haven't even heard of you yet. Cold outreach, basically.
Got it. Outbound. What's second?
Second is the market response function. This team handles and qualifies all the inbound leads, the ones coming through your website forms, your main phone lines, maybe email inquiries. They're like the triage specialists, sorting through who's a good fit.
Inbound qualification.
Okay.
And third?
Third is the dedicated closing function, staffed by your account executives or AEs. Their only focus should be running the sales cycle for qualified leads, presenting solutions, negotiating, and closing deals.
And the warning is, don't try to make one person do all 3 jobs.
Exactly. If you try that, you inevitably end up with random, inconsistent systems. Things fall through the cracks. It's impossible to optimize any single part of the process because everyone's juggling too much. Specialization allows for focus and mastery.
Let's focus on that outbound prospecting function for a moment, the SDRs, because the sources point to a kind of resurgence of outbound sales lately, especially, it seems, when you're targeting larger, more strategic companies, the ones who probably aren't just going to randomly fill out a form on your website.
That's right. Inbound is great, but outbound gives you control. It lets you choose your targets. And yes, it's seeing a comeback, especially for B2B companies aiming for bigger deals.
So what does the baseline math look like for, say, one well-trained SDR? What kind of output should you expect?
The research gives us a really useful baseline for planning, which is great. For, let's say, differentiated B2B solutions, not simple commodities, one well-trained SDR is typically estimated to set up somewhere between 12 and 20 discovery calls or initial demos per month.
12 to 20 calls scheduled per month. Okay, that's the activity metric.
That's the raw activity, yes.
Now, what happens next? Because scheduling a call isn't the same as having a real opportunity, right? How do you separate those 12-20 calls from actual pipeline fuel?
That's where the crucial metric of the sales accepted lead, or SAL, comes in. This is key. An SDR might hustle and qualify 20 initial calls, but maybe only 8 to 10 of those actually meet the company's strict internal criteria for being a genuine opportunity.
What kind of criteria?
Things like, do they have the specific pain points we solve? Do they have a realistic budget or potential budget? Is the person we're talking to have the authority or access to authority to make a decision? Those 8 to 10 that pass that filter are designated as SALs.
Okay, so SAL is the quality gate.
Precisely. It acts as the quality control gate between the market response, or SDR team, and the closing team, the AEs. It ensures the account executives aren't wasting their very valuable time on leads that, marketing might call qualified because they downloaded a white paper. But sales knows deep down are just never going to buy.
Right, avoiding that friction. So, okay, let's take those 8 to 10 quality SALs per SDR per month. What does that typically translate to in terms of actual closed business at the end of the funnel?
Assuming you have a solid, measurable close rate, I'll say a 20% close rate on those truly qualified SALs, which is a reasonable benchmark for many B2B sales.
Okay.
The math becomes pretty clear. One dedicated outbound SDR can reliably generate roughly 1 to 2 new customers per month.
1 to 2 new customers per SDR per month.
Yep. And that predictability allows you to actually model your entire scaling budget and plan. If you know you need, say, 10 new customers a month to hit your growth targets, you can work backwards. You'll likely need somewhere between 5 and 10 SDRs consistently feeding the funnel.
And presumably you'll need enough closers to handle the volume those SDRs generate.
Exactly. Typically, you might need 3 or 4 closers, your AEs, to effectively manage the pipeline generated by those 5 to 10 SDRs. It becomes a predictable ratio.
That definitely makes the growth process seem much more predictable, more like engineering, as you said. But it also highlights a potential risk, doesn't it? That 1 to 2 customer metric per SDR sounds great on paper.
Mm-hmm.
But given the significant cost and training time required for these specialized roles, what do the sources say about the massive risk if that SDR fails to consistently hit that 12-20 call target? Is there a built-in fragility here if you just rely on volume?
That's a really important point. And yes, that fragility is exactly why the specialization has to be paired with high-leverage tactics.
Yeah.
You can't just hire SDRs and tell them to make 100 calls a day blindly.
Right.
If you rely solely on brute force volume dialing, the system becomes incredibly fragile and inefficient. The most effective high-leverage tactics require insight, not just activity.
Okay, so what's an example of a high-leverage tactic?
One really effective one the sources mentioned is called calling high, calling low.
Calling high, calling low. Tell us more about that. How does it work?
It's essentially intelligence gathering disguised as sales outreach. You start by calling a relevant but maybe lower-level employee within the target organization, the low point.
Yeah.
Someone in operations maybe, or a manager directly experiencing the problem you solve.
Okay, not the decision maker initially.
Not initially. Your goal on this low call isn't really to sell, it's to understand.
Mm.
You want to learn about their day-to-day workings, the current tools they use, their specific challenges, the language they use to describe their problems. You're gathering context.
Makes sense? Then what?
Then you leverage that unique, informed perspective when you contact the high point, the C-level executive, the VP, the ultimate decision maker, instead of starting with generic cold pitch.
Which they probably get dozens of.
Exactly. You open with something specific like, hi, decision maker name. I was just speaking with low-level contact name in your operations team. And it sounds like specific system X is causing some real friction with specific problem Y.
That immediately sounds different.
It provides instant, relevant credibility. It shows you've done your homework, you understand their specific context. It differentiates you from 99% of the other cold callers or emails they receive. It shifts the conversation from a generic sales pitch to a potentially insightful consultative discussion right from the start.
I can see how that would dramatically increase the chances of getting engagement. I also really like the concept mentioned, outbound, inbound. That sounds intriguing.
Yeah, outbound inbound is quite elegant, actually. It leverages the same kind of targeted research you'd use for traditional outbound, but it cleverly channels the prospect's response toward your best conversion asset, your website.
How does that work in practice?
Okay, so imagine your targeted outbound outreach. Maybe a highly personalized email or a thoughtful LinkedIn connection request is perfectly tailored to a specific individual at a specific account you know is qualified.
Right.
Often the prospect, if interested, won't even reply directly to that email or message. Instead, what do? They type your company name into Google.
They go check you out independently.
Exactly. They navigate straight to your site to learn more on their own terms. Now, because you know you only targeted pre-qualified accounts with that outbound effort, any leads that subsequently come through your website from those specific companies are inherently high-quality inbound leads. They were effectively driven there by your targeted outbound effort.
That's smart. You're using outbound precision to generate high-quality inbound flow.
Okay, so let's say all this work pays off. You finally get the prospect on the phone for that crucial first discovery call. What is the single most important objective of that conversation? Is it to immediately start selling the product features?
Absolutely not. The sources are incredibly clear on this point. The main objective of that first real conversation is simply to get the prospect talking about their business. And then, crucially, your job is to listen deeply.
Listen for what specifically? You're searching for the real pain points, the underlying strategic issues they're facing, their desired outcomes. What does their dream solution look like? You should only begin to connect your product or service to their key business issues after you have genuinely listened and established that they seem like a clear fit for what you offer.
Pitching too early kills credibility.
Instantly. If you jump into pitching features before understanding their context and validating the fit, you just sound like every other salesperson and you destroy any trust you might have built. Listen first, diagnose, then prescribe.
Okay, makes sense. Now, how do you make sure that conversation actually moves forward into a committed next step, rather than just ending with a polite brush off like, okay, sounds interesting, just send me some materials?
The classic stall. You absolutely must use what the sources refer to as micro-contracts, or sometimes called upfront contracts. This concept is often highlighted in methodologies like Sandler sales training.
Micro-contracts, what does that mean?
It means setting very clear expectations for both the current call and the potential next step, and getting the prospect's explicit agreement at every stage. It removes ambiguity.
Can you give an example of how you'd phrase that?
Sure. At the very beginning of the call, you might say something like, okay, we have about 15 minutes scheduled for today. My goal is just to understand a bit more about their situation and see if there might be a potential fit. If, at the end of these 15 minutes, you don't feel this is relevant for you, are you comfortable telling me no so we don't waste each other's time?
Okay, giving them an easy out.
Yes, which paradoxically makes them more comfortable staying. Then you continue, and if it does seem like there might be something worth exploring further, typically the next step would be a more detailed, maybe 45-minute deep dive where we could look at your specific data or whatever the next logical step is. Does that sound fair as a plan for this call?
Right. That puts the prospect at ease because the potential outcomes and the next step are clearly defined up front. But it also keeps the conversation moving purposefully toward a decision point.
Exactly. No surprises, clear agenda, mutual agreement.
And this discovery call is also the prime moment to disqualify, isn't it? If things aren't lining up.
It is absolutely the optimal moment for disqualification. If, during that conversation, it becomes really clear that the prospect actually lacks the required pain points you solve, or they definitely don't have the budget, or the person you're talking to simply doesn't have the ability to influence a decision, you must disqualify them early.
Why is that so important? Seems counterintuitive to actively push prospects away.
Because your goal is efficiency and focusing resources where they have the highest probability of success. Don't waste your valuable time or your closer's valuable time pursuing a random system, as the sources put it, a lead that fundamentally cannot be converted into a customer.
Okay.
You conclude the conversation professionally, on great terms, thank them sincerely for their time and insights, maybe offer a relevant piece of content if appropriate, and then you move on immediately to the next potentially qualified lead. Discipline in disqualification is crucial for predictable growth.
Okay, so we've established this idea of a specialized engine for predictable sales. But even the best engine is going to stall if the fuel you're putting in it, your message, your value proposition, is confusing or unclear.
Absolutely. That brings us neatly into our second section,
No.
how you actually define and communicate value. This ultimately determines your market potential, who you attract, and how much they're willing to pay.
And the sources frame this starting point, positioning, as the absolute underpinning of the entire business strategy, not just marketing fluff, but core strategy.
That's right. Positioning is fundamentally about establishing context. And the biggest danger here, the sources warn, is often internal inertia. It's surprisingly common.
Inertia how?
Product creators, founders, early employees. They often fail to notice that the product they originally built, let's say it was designed as a simple internal email system, has, over time, actually transformed in the eyes of the customer. Maybe the customer started using it primarily as a crucial group chat platform for remote teams. Or maybe it evolved into a proprietary database that customers now rely on mainly as an analytics platform. The problem is, the founders might still be describing it using the original email system language.
While the customer is experiencing something totally different.
Exactly. And that mismatch, that customer confusion driven by the company's own inertia, the risk of inertia, becomes a massive barrier to sales efficiency. If you don't even know what market you're truly competing in from the customer's perspective, how can you possibly price effectively or craft a sales message that resonates?
You're speaking different languages. Okay, so how do you fix this? Sources propose a disciplined framework, right? A specific order for defining positioning components.
Yes, a very specific order, because the success of each component really dictates the possibilities for the next one. You can't just jump to the end.
So what's step one? Where do you start?
Step one is defining your competitive alternatives. And this is critical. Who or what do customers actually compare you to?
And this isn't just your direct competitors in the same software category.
Not necessarily. It's often the status quo. If your solution automates a manual reporting process, your main competitive alternative isn't necessarily another reporting software. It might literally be your customer manually updating an Excel spreadsheet every Friday afternoon.
Okay. The real-world alternative we're using now.
Precisely. And if they're comparing you to Excel, that immediately tells you something crucial. Your product absolutely must be demonstrably easier or faster or safer or provide some clear advantage over that spreadsheet. That comparison sets the baseline expectation for your value.
Okay, define the real alternatives. What's step two?
Step two is identifying your unique attributes. These are the specific features, capabilities, or characteristics that your offering has that those competitive alternatives lack. This is where you list the concrete nuts and bolts differentiators.
Feature list, basically.
Yes, but focused on what's unique compared to the alternatives identified in step one. Then step three is the crucial translation step, turning those attributes into value.
Translating features into benefits.
Exactly. A unique attribute like, say, triple welded steel frame on a piece of equipment is just a feature. It's technically accurate, but who cares? The value is what matters to the customer. So you translate that. A frame that saves you money on replacement costs because it handles 50% more stress than the standard frames. You must connect the technical detail to the tangible business outcome for the customer.
Features tell, benefits sell. Got it. And the final, most strategic step in this positioning framework.
The fourth step is strategically choosing the optimal market frame. This is where you decide which market category you want to position yourself within. You actively choose a market that inherently highlights your unique value from step 3, and importantly, triggers favorable assumptions in the customer's mind about your competitors and, crucially, your pricing.
Can you give an example of choosing a market frame?
Sure. Let's say you've built a powerful data analytics platform. If you position yourself broadly as just a simple database tool, you're immediately suppressing your perceived value and inviting comparisons to much cheaper alternatives.
Right.
But if you strategically frame yourself as, say, a predictive AI business intelligence suite for e-commerce optimization, you instantly trigger a different set of comparisons, expectations, and a far higher pricing reference point in the customer's mind. Positioning isn't just about describing what you are. It's about consciously choosing a context that gives you a strategic advantage.
That makes perfect sense. Okay, so once that core positioning is locked down, the next layer is crafting the outward narrative, the story you tell the market. And this is where the clarity of something like the story brand framework comes in. The advice here seems absolutely critical. Cut through all the noise with utter simplicity.
Yes, the SB7 framework or similar narrative structures really force that simplicity. It leverages a universal archetype that resonates deeply. The customer must always be positioned as the hero of the story. Think Luke Skywalker.
Okay, the customer is the hero. Where does the company fit in?
The company, your brand, must take the role of the guide. Think Yoda or Obi-Wan. When the company acts as the wise, experienced guide, focused entirely on helping the hero succeed, it's immediately recognized as a trusted resource, not just another vendor trying to sell something.
So positioning yourself as the guide isn't just like good salesmanship.
No, the sources argue it's a fundamental pillar of being recognized as a credible thought leader and resource in a very noisy marketplace. It shifts the focus entirely to the customer's success.
The framework also contains a couple of elements that seem specifically designed to address that customer inertia and confusion we talked about earlier. The process plan and the aspirational identity. How do those help the customer actually decide to move forward?
Right, the process plan directly alleviates confusion. Think about it. When things seem complicated or unclear, what do people usually do?
They hesitate. They stop.
Exactly, they stop. The process plan combats this by providing a clear, simple paved sidewalk for the customer to walk on. It typically involves just 3 to 5 simple logical steps. For example, step 1, test drive the car. Step 2, complete the purchase paperwork. Step 3, enjoy 3 years of free maintenance.
It makes the path forward look easy and predictable.
Precisely. That predictability reduces anxiety and friction, making it much easier for the customer to take the next step. It removes the what happens next uncertainty.
Okay, and the aspirational identity, that sounds more emotional.
It is. It's the emotional payoff. You're not just selling a product. You're inviting customers into a story that improves how they see themselves.
How does that work?
We'll take the dog food example from the sources. You aren't just selling bags of kibble. You're potentially transforming the customer's self-perception from, say, a passive dog owner who just buys whatever's cheapest into every dog's hero, someone who actively prioritizes their beloved pet's long-term health and well-being by choosing premium nutrition.
Ah, you're selling a better version of the customer to themselves.
Exactly. And that emotional value derived from achieving a better identity, from self-improvement, is often far more powerful and motivating than just the functional value of the product itself.
And all of this, the hero, the guide, the plan, the identity, it should all converge on what the framework calls the controlling idea.
Yes, the controlling idea is like the simple core moral of the story. It needs to be crystal clear, easily repeatable, and used consistently across all your messaging, website, sales pitches, ads, everything.
What makes a good controlling idea?
It's the single memorable point you're trying to lodge in the customer's mind. We should ideally elicit a positive reaction or understanding without needing a long explanation. For instance, if your whole business is built around simplifying complex processes, your controlling idea might be something punchy like simple tools beat complex problems. Or, finally, Business software that works the way you think.
Simple, sticky, repeatable. Okay. That clarity and narrative brings us nicely from storytelling to the hard numbers, measurement. Our sources draw a really vital distinction between vanity metrics, the ones that look good but don't help, and truly actionable metrics when you're trying to determine the actual health of the business.
This is so crucial. A good metric, the source's stress, is one that actually changes the way you behave. That's the ultimate test of his usefulness.
And raw revenue isn't always a good metric by that standard.
It often isn't. Raw revenue going up and to the right on a chart might feel great. It feeds the ego, hence vanity metric, but it can easily hide severe underlying problems.
Like what could be hiding behind rising revenue?
Well, for example, you might be acquiring customers much faster, but maybe they're churning out just as fast. Or maybe the cost to acquire each new dollar of revenue is skyrocketing. Raw revenue alone doesn't show you that.
So what's a better indicator of real business health then?
Revenue per customer is cited repeatedly as a far better, much more actionable indicator, specifically because it's usually a ratio or an average.
Why does that make it more actionable?
Because if your overall raw revenue is increasing, fantastic.
Right.
But if your revenue per customer is simultaneously decreasing, that tells you something important immediately. It signals that you're likely relying too heavily on acquiring ever cheaper, lower value customers to keep the top line growing.
Okay, I see. It reveals the quality of the revenue growth.
Exactly. And knowing that prompts a specific behavioral change. You realize you probably need to increase your prices, or shift your marketing focus towards higher tier customers, or maybe improve your upselling and cross-selling to existing customers. A raw revenue number alone would never give you that specific diagnostic insight.
Makes sense. The sources also lay out a critical growth sequence, sort of stages you need to pass through that they say is pretty much non-negotiable for sustained scaling. What's that sequence?
Ignore this sequence at your peril, basically. It's presented almost like gospel. Stickiness comes before virality, and virality comes before scale.
Okay, break that down. Stickiness first.
Stickiness means your product or service actually delivers value, and customers stick around. They don't churn out quickly. You need to prove this first. Trying to achieve rapid growth, virality, or scale before you have confirmed product market fit, before you know the product is sticky, is incredibly dangerous.
Why is it so dangerous? Seems like growth is always good.
Because you end up pouring resources into acquiring customers who are just going to leave quickly. You accelerate churn, you burn cash like crazy, and you basically build your growth on a leaky foundation that's destined to collapse. You must prove customers stick around and get value before you hit the accelerator on acquiring lots of new ones.
Do they give any examples or benchmarks for stickiness?
Yeah. Buffer, the social media tool, was mentioned. They track churn religiously from the early days. They set a target of getting monthly churn below 5%, which is pretty good for SaaS. And they apparently only really moved into aggressive mass acquisition strategies after they consistently achieved a churn rate closer to 2%. They plugged the leaks before scaling the inflow.
Stickiness, then virality, getting users to bring in other users, then scale, pouring fuel on the fire.
Got it. Finally, in this section, let's touch on the financial mechanics that actually make growth sustainable. Specifically, the idea of customer-funded growth and this really critical concept of the cash-free growth zone.
Right. Customer-funded models are definitely worth exploring, especially early on. Things like the matchmaker model, where you connect buyers and sellers and collect a fee or commission up front before delivering the full service, or the scarcity model, like limited-time flash sales that bring cash in quickly.
Why are these models helpful?
They're great because they minimize your upfront capital risk. The customers are essentially funding the operations growth, and achieving early traction with these models can provide crucial validation and confidence both internally and for potential future investors. But for understanding truly sustainable, potentially rapid scaling, you need to grasp this concept of the cash-free growth zone.
Okay, this involved that complex-sounding ratio you touched on earlier. Can you define the cash-free growth zone again? How does a company achieve it? The company can achieve high growth rates expanding rapidly and yet still not burn through cash or even generate cash if its net income percentage to revenue, basically its profit margin, is higher than its trade capital percentage to revenue.
Okay, let's unpack that ratio. Net income percentage, that's profit margin, clear enough. What exactly is trade capital in this context, and why is the relationship between these two percentages the critical lever?
Okay, trade capital, which is often used interchangeably with working capital in this context, primarily consists of two main things you use cash for. Accounts receivable, that's money owed to you by your customers that you haven't collected yet, plus the value of your inventory, if you carry inventory, minus accounts payable. That's money you owe to your suppliers that you haven't paid yet.
So it's basically the cash tied up in the day-to-day operations of buying, making, selling, and collecting.
Exactly. And here's the key.
Right.
When a company grows rapidly, its trade capital requirements often grow rapidly too. You need to buy more raw materials, increasing inventory. You have more customers who owe you money, increasing receivables. Growth consumes cash in the short term.
Right.
Now, if your net income percentage, your profit margin on each sale, is too low compared to how much additional trade capital you need to lock up just to support that growth, you will actually run out of cash, even if you look profitable on paper according to your income statement.
Ah, the growing broke phenomenon.
Precisely. The cash-free growth zone ratio ensures that the actual cash profits generated by your increasing revenue are sufficient to cover the cash required by the growth in working capital itself. And beyond just this ratio, the sources emphasize that all significant growth investment decisions should be constantly evaluated using metrics like return on invested capital, ROIC, to make sure that the capital you do deploy for growth is always being used as efficiently and profitably as possible.
All right, that takes us logically into Section 3, the human machine. We've talked about optimizing the sales systems, clarifying the value proposition and narrative, understanding the financial plumbing. But none of it actually scales without the right people operating within the right management culture.
Exactly. The human element is where the best laid plans often succeed or fail.
So let's start with maybe the most fundamental human element for navigating growth. The mindset. The sources draw heavily on the concept of the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset.
Yes, this distinction, largely based on Carol Dweck's research, is presented as absolutely critical. People with a predominantly fixed mindset tend to view their intelligence, their abilities, their talents as innate fixed traits, like you're born with a certain out, and that's it.
And how does that affect their behavior, especially in a challenging business environment?
Because they believe failure defines them as fundamentally inadequate or not smart enough, they tend to avoid effort and shy away from challenges where they might fail. It's too risky to their self-image. They might actually have high confidence, but the sources describe it as extremely fragile.
Fragile how?
The moment they face a real setback or even just have to exert genuine difficult effort to learn something new, that confidence can just collapse. Because in their view, if you have to work hard at something, it must mean you aren't naturally good at it. So they might choose an easier path, make excuses, or simply give up, rather than risk looking incompetent.
Okay, so that sounds pretty detrimental in a startup or scaling environment where challenges are constant. What about the growth mindset?
The growth mindset, conversely, sees abilities, intelligence, skills, talents as dynamic and expandable through dedication, effort, and learning from mistakes. People with this mindset tend to embrace challenges as opportunities to develop. They view mistakes not as reflections of their fixed inadequacy, but as valuable learning and coaching opportunities.
So that sounds much more adaptive for growth.
Absolutely vital. Because scaling a business is, by its very definition, a process of continuous challenge, learning, and adaptation. Therefore, leaders have a responsibility to actively cultivate this growth mindset culture.
How can leaders do that?
They need to intentionally shut down any signs of elitism, the idea that some people are just naturals and others aren't. They need to frame mistakes and failures not as reasons to blame individuals, but as opportunities to learn, to coach, and ultimately to improve the underlying systems or processes that may have contributed to the error. It's about fostering development, not judgment.
Okay, shifting from individual mindset to management practices themselves, the concept of high leverage management comes up frequently. How did someone like Andy Grove, the former Intel CEO, define management leverage? What makes an activity high leverage for a manager?
Grove had a really powerful definition. He said, a manager's output isn't just their own work. It's the output of their organization, plus the output of the neighboring organizations under their influence. High leverage activities, then, are those where a manager's input, their time, their effort, their decision leads to disproportionately large results across their team or even beyond.
Can you give some examples of high leverage managerial activities?
The sources, drawing from Grove, highlight three primary ways leverage occurs. First, when a brief, well-focused managerial action affects a person's behavior or output over a long period. Think about spending, say, 15 minutes carefully crafting a clear, one-page standard operating procedure for a task that 50 people will then use correctly for the next year. That 15 minutes has huge leverage.
Okay, lasting impact from a small input. What else?
Second, leverage occurs when one manager's single action affects many people simultaneously, like conducting one effective training session for all new hires on a critical skill rather than training them one-on-one inefficiently.
Makes sense. One-to-many impact.
And third, high leverage happens when an individual supplies a unique, key piece of knowledge or insight that affects a large group's work. Imagine the expert engineer who provides a crucial technical insight that unblocks 20 different development teams who are all stuck on the same problem. That single insight has massive leverage.
That concept of focused action and clear communication seems to tie directly into another management tool the sources emphasize, objectives and key results, or OKRs.
Absolutely. OKRs are presented as perhaps the highest leverage tool available for driving clarity, alignment, and accountability across an organization. They force leaders to clearly articulate not just what the measurable key results they expect, but also the crucial why, the overarching objective, the purpose behind the work.
And the sources stress that just setting team OKRs isn't enough. They need to be elevated.
Yes, for maximum impact, especially on cross-functional initiatives, objectives often need to be formally elevated to become company-wide OKRs. This ensures lateral support and alignment across different departments.
Can you give an example of that elevation creating alignment?
A classic example often cited comes from Google's early days, sometimes referred to as Operation Crush. When leadership made the objective of significantly improving user login security and speed, a top-level, company-wide OKR with a strict, ambitious 3-month deadline.
Okay.
It immediately communicated to every other team from visual design to back-end infrastructure to legal that this work took absolute priority over almost everything else for that quarter. Everyone knew they needed to lend support, allocate resources, and clear roadblocks for the teams working on Operation Crush. That simple act of elevation created intense focus and alignment, cutting through potential interdepartmental conflicts over resources or priorities.
That's powerful. And for managing the pace of these goals, the sources recommend a dual tracking system.
Yes, they suggest using dual tracking, setting quarterly OKRs for driving short-term execution and achieving immediate goals, while also maintaining annual OKRs that are key to the longer-term strategic trajectory of the company. The quarterly goals should clearly ladder up to support the annual ones.
Okay, let's zoom in on the one-on-one dynamic. When a manager is dealing with a specific team member, how should they determine the best management style to use? Should it always be hands-off, empowering autonomy?
Not at all, according to the research. The optimal management style must be flexible and tailored specifically to the task-relevant maturity, TRM, of the subordinate for the specific task at hand.
Task-relevant maturity, TRM, what does that encompass?
TRM is described as a combination of factors: the individual's readiness, their achievement orientation, their relevant education or training, and their prior experience. But here's the crucial caveat. TRM is not a general trait of the person. It's specific to the particular task they're being asked to do right now.
So someone can have high TRM for one thing and low TRM for another.
Exactly. Think about a star software engineer. They might have extremely high TRM when it comes to writing complex code. For that task, the manager should use a low supervision, highly autonomous style delegate and get out of the way.
Right.
But now, let's say you assign that same brilliant engineer to manage a $5 million vendor contract negotiation for the first time, a task completely outside their core expertise. Suddenly, for that specific task, their TRM is temporarily low. They lack the experience and possibly the training.
So the manager needs to adapt.
Precisely. In that situation, the manager needs to shift to a high supervision, more directive instructional management style, providing clear guidance, regular check-ins, and coaching until the engineer's TRM for that task increases. Good managers constantly adapt their style based on the task and the individual's maturity level with respect to it.
That makes a lot of sense. Context matters. Okay, moving on to perhaps the highest leverage decision a manager makes: hiring. The focus in the sources seems less about finding the mythical perfect candidate and more about rigorously filtering out the wrong people.
Yes, filtering is paramount. Getting hiring wrong is incredibly costly, not just financially, but in terms of team morale and lost productivity. The sources stress looking for 3 essential traits beyond just the necessary technical skills for the role.
What are those 3 traits?
First, high intellectual acumen, basically. The raw intelligence or smarts to quickly grasp complex problems and innovative solutions, which is common in fast-growing companies.
Okay, brains. Second.
Second, a high figure-shit-out quotient. That's the slightly crude but descriptive term used. It means resourceful street smarts, the demonstrated ability to encounter unforeseen problems or ambiguity and figure out a solution independently without needing constant hand-holding.
Resourcefulness, resilience. And third.
Third, a high grinder quotient. This refers to the sheer willingness and capacity to put in the hard, persistent, sometimes unglamorous effort that's inevitably required to succeed in a demanding growth company environment. It's about work ethic and perseverance.
Brains, resourcefulness, and grit. Got it. The sources also outline a pretty rigorous selection process, mentioning the A method for hiring. What makes that particular structure supposedly so effective at identifying these traits and filtering?
The A method, as described, centers heavily on using scorecards. These aren't just job descriptions. They're documents that explicitly link the overall organizational strategy directly to the specific, quantifiable outcomes expected for this particular role. It forces clarity up front about what success actually looks like.
So it makes hiring more objective, less based on gut feel.
Exactly. It translates the business plan into concrete, measurable role-by-role contributions. Then during the interviews, you use rigorous, structured questioning techniques. One example mentioned is the 3Ps method for digging into past accomplishment.
The 3 APs.
Yeah, for any significant accomplishment the candidate claims, you probe deeply. First, what were the preconditions? What was the situation, the context, the specific goal you were given? Second, what was the actual process you followed? What steps did you personally take? What challenges did you face? Who else was involved? And third, what was the payoff? What were the specific measurable results? How do you know it was a success?
So it helps verify their actual contribution and impact.
Precisely. It helps filter out candidates who might try to take credit for team accomplishments they weren't primarily responsible for, or who exaggerate the results. It forces concrete details.
And there's a particularly strong warning in the sources regarding patterns in past job performance, right?
A very strong, data-driven warning. Be extremely wary of and probably do not hire anyone who appears to have been pushed out, fired, or laid off from 20% or more of their previous jobs.
20% or more. Why such a specific threshold?
The research cited suggests these individuals have a statistically 3 times higher chance of being chronic underperformers, what they call B or C players in your organization. The underlying pattern of poor fit or performance, they argue, is usually fixed and likely to repeat itself. It's a significant red flag.
Okay, a tough but potentially useful filter. Finally, within this human-machine section, we need to address the often delicate challenge of business partnerships and eventually succession. These relationships seem notoriously fragile.
They are indeed high-stakes, high-leverage relationships. And unfortunately, few people are ever really taught how to be effective business partners. It's often learned through painful trial and error. That's why the sources strongly advocate for creating a partnership charter right from the beginning or as early as possible.
A partnership charter, what is that? Like a legal document?
It can have legal aspects, but it's more of a formalized structure or agreement that forces partners to have structured discussions up front around 3 key areas: the business issues, strategy, finances, operations; the relationship issues, roles, responsibilities, communication, conflict resolution, and future continuity, buy-sell agreements, succession planning, what happens if someone wants out.
So it forces uncomfortable conversations early.
Exactly. And one key function of the charter the sources emphasize is forcing partners to clearly distinguish between their ownership roles, based on equity stakes, and their management roles, based on day-to-day responsibilities and capabilities.
Why is that distinction so important?
Because if management roles and responsibilities are assigned based purely on ownership percentages, rather than on who is actually best suited and most capable for that specific job, you create a system where objective performance evaluation becomes nearly impossible. How can one partner hold another accountable for poor performance in marketing if that partner is in charge of marketing simply because they own 50% of the company, not because they're skilled at it?
Right. It prevents merit-based assessment.
Yeah.
And how does this charter process help immunize the partnership against eventual collapse, which happens so often?
The main way is by proactively addressing what the sources call the destructive power of unmet expectations. The charter process forces partners to have thorough, sometimes difficult and uncomfortable conversations about every expectation they have of each other: time commitment, financial contributions, risk tolerance, decision-making authority, lifestyle goals, exit strategies, everything.
Getting it all out in the open.
Yes. Bringing all those assumptions and expectations out of the shadows and into the light of day for discussion and agreement. because unmet expectations, left unspoken and festering beneath the surface, are almost always the poison that eventually destroys business partnerships. The Charter aims to inoculate against that poison through radical upfront clarity.
Okay, our final section takes us into perhaps the deeper architecture of achieving inevitable success, digging into the psychology of risk, how we make decisions under uncertainty, and how that plays out in high-stakes situations like negotiation. Let's start with a really crucial concept from the sources that helps define system health.
Anti-fragility.
Yes, anti-fragility. This concept, popularized by Nassim Nicholas Taleb, is fundamental. It's important to understand it's not just being resilient or robust or tough. Robustness means you resist shock and stay the same. Anti-fragility is the opposite of fragility.
Opposite how?
An anti-fragile system actually likes volatility, error, randomness, and stressors, up to a point. It gets stronger when exposed to them. Fragile systems, conversely, hate volatility. They break easily under stress. Why is this distinction so critical for businesses?
Because in the real world, the sources argue, nearly everything that exhibits a nonlinear response to stimulus, meaning the impact isn't proportional to the input, is either fragile or anti-fragile. There's very little that's truly just robust in the middle.
Okay, nonlinear response. What does that mean practically for a company's structure or strategy? Give me an example.
Think about systems with concave exposures. Those are the fragile ones. Concave means that as the stressor gets bigger, the negative impact increases disproportionately faster and faster.
Okay.
So a highly optimized just-in-time supply chain that relies entirely on one single supplier in one specific geographic location might seem efficient in stable times, but it's deeply fragile. A small stressor, like a minor traffic jam delaying a shipment, is probably fine. But a major unexpected disruption, a geopolitical crisis shutting down that region, a natural disaster doesn't just hurt it linearly, it collapses the entire system, causing far more damage than you'd expect from just doubling or tripling the initial stress. It has a concave, fragile response.
So the pursuit of extreme efficiency can actually create fragility. Trying to eliminate all volatility and stress is counterproductive.
It can be incredibly dangerous. The sources argue it's often a denial of hormesis. Hormesis is the biological concept where a small dose of something that would be harmful in large doses, like a toxin or stress, actually triggers beneficial adaptive responses in the organism, making it stronger.
Like exercise stressing muscles to make them grow.
Exactly like exercise.
Right.
Or vaccines, introducing a small amount of antigen to stimulate the immune system. By denying our social systems, economic systems, or even biological systems, these slight stressors, this necessary randomness and episodic deprivation, by trying to place them in what Taleb colorfully calls a Procrustean bed of overly planned, rigid, cushy comfort.
Procrustean bed, like forcing things into a standard size.
Precisely. From the Greek myth, where Procrustes stretched or cut his guests to fit his bed. By trying to force complex systems into these overly optimized, predictable, comfortable states and eliminating all stressors, we are paradoxically fragilizing them. We're making them less able to cope with the inevitable real-world shocks when they do occur.
What would be a business example of this denial of hormesis leading to fragility?
Okay, imagine a company that eliminates all cross-training between departments because it's deemed inefficient in the short term. Everyone is hyper-specialized in their silo. That system might run very smoothly and comfortably day to day. But the moment one key employee in a critical role leaves unexpectedly, the entire process that depended solely on them might completely break down because no one else has even basic familiarity. The lack of built-in redundancy, the lack of that small, inefficient stress of cross-training made it fragile.
Versus an anti-fragile company.
An anti-fragile company, conversely, might intentionally introduce small, regular stress tests. Maybe things like quarterly cross-departmental projects that force people out of their comfort zones, or even intentionally implementing brief periods of episodic deprivation, like temporarily cutting certain budgets just to force teams to find more resourceful ways to operate. These small stressors force the system to adapt, build redundancies, and become stronger, more capable of handling larger, unexpected shocks later.
This connects to another warning in the sources. This desire to eliminate volatility often leads to harmful over-intervention, particularly when managers or systems are faced with natural, random variability.
Yes, the risk of iatrogenics harm caused by the healer, or in this case, the manager. Frequent measurement and intervention, even when done with the very best intentions, can often be harmful because people in automated systems tend to overreact to statistical noise, mistaking random fluctuations for meaningful signals.
The blood pressure example they used was striking.
It's a perfect illustration. If a healthy person's blood pressure naturally fluctuates around an average, and let's say it randomly measures above normal about half the time just due to natural variation,
Right.
and a doctor, following a rigid protocol, automatically prescribes medication every single time they see a reading above that threshold, what happens? Half the perfectly healthy population ends up on unnecessary medication, potentially suffering side effects. The doctor's treating random variation as actionable information, leading to harmful intervention and arguably increasing the patient's long-term fragility by making them dependent on medication they didn't need. Managers do the same thing with business metrics all the time.
Overreacting to the noise. This leads us directly into how our intuitive minds actually handle decisions, especially under uncertainty in business. We're talking about the famous System 1 versus System 2 thinking.
Yes, Daniel Kahneman's Nobel-winning work. System 1 is our intuitive, fast, automatic, effortless, and often emotional thinking. It operates constantly in the background. It relies heavily on heuristics, mental shortcuts, and importantly, on cognitive ease.
Cognitive ease. What's that?
Cognitive ease is basically a feeling of familiarity, fluency, and low effort. If something feels familiar, easy to process, or comes to mind quickly, System 1 tends to judge it as true, good, or probable. This is why we jump to conclusions, trust our gut feelings, and readily accept stereotypes or simple explanations they feel easy. But this reliance on cognitive ease is also what leads to predictable cognitive biases and illusions.
And System 2 is the opposite.
System 2 is our slow, deliberate, effortful, analytical, rational system. It's what we use for complex calculations, logical reasoning, and overriding System 1's impulses. The big problem, Kahneman argues, is that System 2 is fundamentally indolent. It requires significant mental energy and it's easily fatigued. So, much of the time, System 2 just performs a minimal, perfunctory check and ends up endorsing System 1's quick, intuitive suggestions, even if they're flawed.
So we default to the quick and easy System 1 most of the time, which leaves us wide open to these cognitive traps and biases. One of the most dangerous traps for founders, it seems, is the illusion of control.
It appears remarkably pervasive, yes. The sources cite surveys where founders of innovative startups were asked a fascinating question. How much of the ultimate outcome of their venture would depend on what they personally did within their firm versus external factors outside their control like luck, competitor actions, or broad market shifts?
And what do they typically answer?
The answer was consistently something like never less than 80%. They overwhelmingly believed their fate was almost entirely in their own hands. This is the powerful, seductive illusion of control.
Why is that illusion so dangerous?
Because it causes founders and leaders to systematically neglect or underestimate the crucial, often dominant roles played by luck, timing, competitors' moves, unexpected macroeconomic changes, regulatory shifts, and all sorts of unforeseen market dynamics. This can lead to dangerous overconfidence, inadequate contingency planning, and brittle, inflexible decision-making when the unexpected inevitably happens.
Underestimating the role of randomness. We also see in the sources how subtle psychological elements like framing can completely obfuscate supposedly rational choices.
Absolutely. Decisions are rarely made based on objective value or probability alone. They are highly dependent on the reference point from which the decision is viewed. The example of Anthony and Betty facing the exact same gamble is classic.
Remind us of that one.
Traditional economic utility theory would predict Anthony and Betty make the same rational choice when offered the same gamble. But they won't, Kahneman argues, because their reference points, their starting levels of wealth are different. The potential gain or loss feels psychologically different relative to where they started, fundamentally altering their perception of the risk and their ultimate choice, even if the objective probabilities are identical.
So context and starting point matter hugely.
Hugely. And we see this acutely in business communication and decision-making with the framing effect. The famous Asian disease problem demonstrates this perfectly. When identical outcomes are presented to people framed in terms of lives saved, a gain frame, they tend to choose the certain option. But when the exact same outcomes are framed in terms of lives lost, a loss frame, people suddenly become risk-seeking and choose the gamble, even though the underlying probabilities haven't changed at all.
Wow. So how you frame a proposal or a decision internally can dramatically alter the choice people make.
Dramatically. Framing isn't just window dressing. It often dictates the outcome when you're seeking buy-in, negotiating, or making internal risk assessments. Understanding framing is a critical psychological tool.
Okay, let's use that to transition to our final topic.
Yeah.
High-stakes negotiation, where psychological advantage and understanding these biases are absolutely key. What's the fundamental mindset shift that the sources say great negotiators embrace regarding rejection, regarding hearing the word no?
They actively seek no. This sounds completely counterintuitive, right? We're usually trained to avoid no at all costs.
Yeah, get to yes.
Right. But great negotiators understand that a polite early no is actually a form of protection. It protects both sides from agreeing to a bad deal simply out of politeness, pressure, or momentum. Getting a no clarifies boundaries.
Okay, it prevents bad agreements. What else?
Furthermore, getting that no out on the table early often signals the real start of the negotiation, not the end. Why? Because it reduces barriers to open communication. When the counterpart feels they have the acknowledged right to say no without offending you, they feel respected and understood. Paradoxically, this often makes them more open to listening to your perspective and exploring peaceful compromises later in the conversation. No often means I'm not ready to agree yet, not I will never agree.
That's a fascinating reframing of no. What about the pressure we put on ourselves with deadlines and negotiation?
Deadlines are often described as self-inflicted bogeymen in negotiation. If you have a strict internal deadline, maybe you need the deal signed by the end of the quarter for your bonus and the other side doesn't know about it, you put yourself at a massive disadvantage.
How so? Why is hiding your deadline bad?
Because as your hitting deadline approaches, what do you subconsciously start doing? You start speeding up your concessions. You become more willing to give things away to get the deal done now. Meanwhile, the other side, believing they have plenty of time, holds out, hoping for even more concessions from you. You end up negotiating entirely against yourself, against your own clock.
So what's the advice? Reveal your deadlines.
Not necessarily reveal them explicitly all the time, but successful negotiators manage their time constraints strategically. They don't let hidden deadlines force them into making bad concessions. Sometimes using a deadline openly can create urgency, but hiding it almost always weakens your position.
Okay, final point here. We must touch on the subtle but powerful psychological lever of consistency and commitment. How does this work in influence and negotiation?
Consistency is a fundamental human drive. People have a deep need to see themselves and be seen by others as consistent in their beliefs, words, and actions. This creates a powerful psychological lever. The sources highlight that even simple, subtle reminders of someone's past commitments, statements, or positions can significantly spur them to act in accordance with those earlier stances, even if it requires effort now.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Reminding medical professionals of their commitment to the Hippocratic Oath before asking them to adopt a new, perhaps difficult, patient safety protocol can increase compliance. Or in a sales context, reminding a client of their previously stated goals for improving operational efficiency before recommending a new software solution that requires some implementation effort can make them more receptive. You're leveraging their desire to be consistent with their own stated values or goals.
So you're essentially cueing their past self to influence their present actions.
Exactly. Past positions, beliefs, actions, even small initial commitments, like agreeing to a small request first, known as the foot-in-the-door technique, can be leveraged to cue present commitment and influence future behavior. People fundamentally strive to appear consistent, and skilled negotiators and leaders understand how to ethically tap into that powerful drive.
Wow, okay. We have covered a massive amount of ground today in this deep dive. We've really synthesized what sustainable, maybe even inevitable success looks like. And the clear message is, it's not some magical outcome. It's the predictable result of building rigorous, intentional, high-leverage systems.
That's the core takeaway. We saw the absolute necessity of things like specialized sales funnels to create predictable lead flow. We looked at adopting truly actionable financial metrics, things like revenue per customer, understanding the cash-free growth zone ratio instead of just chasing vanity numbers.
And we really emphasized the human side, too, the importance of cultivating a high-leverage organization, which starts with fostering that crucial growth mindset and then applying smart management principles like OKRs and adapting style based on task-relevant maturity.
And layered on top of all that, we highlighted the profound, often unseen impact of behavioral psychology. Understanding concepts like anti-fragility helps us build systems that don't just survive stress, but actually benefit from it. Recognizing cognitive ease, the illusion of control, framing effects, being aware of these biases is vital for mitigating risk, especially for founders and leaders making critical decisions under uncertainty.
It really comes down to this. Intentional, consistent systems informed by psychology will beat random effort, brute force, and mere aspiration every single time.
Well said.
So, to wrap up, here is a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to take away and mull over. Given the proven power of specialization we discussed, particularly in sales, and the demonstrated frailty of our own human judgment when facing uncertainty and the lure of cognitive ease, where in your current business, or maybe even just your daily routine, are you most susceptible to confusing a random system? One that produces unpredictable results you can't really improve or replicate with a consistent system, one that you could potentially optimize and scale.
And building on that, what is the absolute smallest, most immediate first campaign? That single targeted call, that one specific email, that tiny process test you could launch, maybe even today, to start testing that assumption, to see if you can turn a piece of randomness into something more predictable.
Apply the discipline. Start the
The
test.
deep dive continues. We encourage you to keep exploring these ideas.
We'll see you next time on the deep dive.